When Renault joined Formula 1 at the 1977 British Grand Prix, they opted to do something a little bit different from everyone else. Whilst most teams were using a 3-litre naturally aspirated engine of some sort, typically a Cosworth DFV or a Ferrari Flat 12, the rules allowed for teams to use a 1.5-litre turbocharged engine instead, the option that Renault ultimately went for. The RS01 was little more than an experimental test car, the chassis being kept as simple as possible to aid in development of the turbocharged engine. The engine itself, designated the EF1, was made almost entirely out of cast iron to help withstand the pressures of the turbocharger. The engine was chronically unreliable, with the car failing to finish the majority of the Grand Prix it started from 1977 until its final race at the 1979 Belgian Grand Prix at the hands of René Arnoux. Jean-Pierre Jabouille would be the car's most experienced driver, driving the car for the majority of its 25 races and scoring its only points finish at the 1978 United States Grand Prix. The car would be replaced by the RS10 in 1979, which would achieve the first ever turbocharged victory in Formula 1, and laying the groundworks for the upcoming turbocharged era of the 1980s. Whilst the Renault F1 team did come within a sniff of championship glory at the 1983 season, their consistent unreliability and various other operational failures prevented them from being able to do so, much to the chagrin of Alain Prost, their star driver. Worsening results in 1984 and 85 saw Renault withdraw from Formula 1 as a constructor, but they would continue supplying their engines to other teams such as Lotus. Whilst Ligier and Tyrrell also ran Renault engines at some point, Lotus was the only other team to achieve Grand Prix victories whilst running them as an engine supplier. This in particular is the 98T from 1986, using the ultimate evolution of Renault's original turbocharged engine, the EF15B. The 98T would go on to take 2 Grand Prix victories that season, both at the hands of Ayrton Senna, as well as 6 other podiums. Whilst in the hands of second driver Johnny Dumfries, it achieved a grand total of just 3 points. The Lotus Renault 98T would go on to score 58 points across 1986, enough to finish 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. And at the end of 1986, Renault would withdraw from Formula 1 entirely. Renault would make a comeback, however, just a few years later in 1989 to power Williams to second place in the Constructors' Championship, albeit a rather distant second place with almost half as many points as the dominant McLarens. Their new 3.5-litre naturally aspirated V10 engine would taste the champagne twice that season, both at the hands of Thierry Boutsen, and the following year, in 1990, the FW13B would taste it twice more, once at the hands of Boutsen and again at the hands of Riccardo Patrese. But 1991 was when the Renault engine started to come into its own, as Williams, one of the most technologically advanced teams in the sport at the time, started getting their act together. Whilst they would narrowly miss out on the championship in 1991, in 1992 the technologically advanced FW14B, powered by a Renault RS4 V10, would go on to dominate the championship, bringing Nigel Mansell and Williams the championship double. This was the start of a period of dominance for Renault, as they would go on to win one or both of the championships for the next 5 years, with Renault engines powering every single Constructors' Champion until 1997, and all but one of the Drivers' Champions until that same year. Of that 6-year Renault-powered dominant streak, the Ford-powered Benetton B194 was the one standout car from that streak, whose only real relation to Renault would be the fact that the Enstone-based team that ran it would eventually be taken over by them. Whilst Benetton had won races before, 1994 was the first time that the team would taste championship glory at the hands of its driver, Michael Schumacher. Whilst its Ford V8 engine was less powerful than the V10s and V12s that surrounded it, the B194 was much more lighter and nimbler than its competitors, especially in the practice hands of Schumacher. Schumacher would win 6 of the first 7 rounds of the 1994 season, giving him a considerable lead over his next closest rival, the Williams of Damon Hill. Schumacher's season, however, would start to fall apart a bit at the British Grand Prix, when he would earn himself a disqualification for ignoring black flags, and then another DSQ just a few rounds later at the Belgian Grand Prix for a worn skid block. This pair of disqualifications would earn Schumacher a 2-race ban, which would allow Damon Hill the opportunity to close the gap. This was not the only controversy to strike Benetton that year, as the team would be accused of continuing to use banned driver aids, such as launch control, that had been outlawed at the end of the previous season. The B194's computer systems did indeed hold the programming for a launch control, but there was no way for the FIA to prove that this had ever been activated, and thus the team went unpenalised. These days, if such a program was discovered on a modern Formula 1 car's computers, the team would probably be disqualified immediately, regardless of whether it had been used or not. And then there was one final controversy at the final round of the season in Australia, the championship finale between Schumacher and Hill, who were separated by just a single point. Michael had to finish ahead of Damon to win the championship, and he looked completely in control of the Grand Prix right up until he lost control, made a mistake, almost hitting the wall, opening up the door for Damon to make an overtake. With Damon up the inside and Michael on the outside, Michael decided that he would rather crash into Damon and end the championship that way. Schumacher would retire from the race immediately with terminal damage, whilst Damon would limp around to the pits to discover that his suspension was also out for the count. This dual retirement gave Schumacher his first world championship, under controversial circumstances. For the 1995 season, Benetton managed to secure a Renault customer engine deal, courtesy of team boss Flavio Briatore buying rival Ligier team and convincing Renault to supply their engines to Benetton instead. Somehow, it's very complicated. Nevertheless, that gave Benetton access to what was regarded as the best engine on the grid, and for good reason. After all, it was in the middle of a championship-winning streak. The new B195 was clearly an evolution of the preceding B194, and it would be driven yet again by Michael Schumacher and his new teammate Johnny Herbert. Given its origins, it had likely been designed with a Ford engine in mind. Thus, the addition of the heavier Renault V10 is probably what made it such a twitchy car that, according to Schumacher, was only fast when driven on the edge. And fast it was, at least in the hands of Schumacher, who would go on to win 9 Grand Prix that season, with 2 more Grand Prix being won by Herbert. Despite being seen as an inferior car to the Williams FW17 that was designed by the now legendary Adrian Newey, the B195 would prove to be the dominating force of the 1995 season, despite its many issues. Benetton would spend much of the season battling with fellow Renault-powered team, Williams, plus the occasional challenge from Ferrari. Schumacher and Hill would battle it out for championship glory again, though Hill would ultimately fall short once again, with Schumacher taking the championship at the Pacific Grand Prix. Ahead of the 1996 season, Schumacher would depart the team for Ferrari, taking much of the team's staff with him, with names like Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne going on to prove crucial in Ferrari's coming dominance. With Schumacher and Herbert both gone, they took on Ferrari's former drivers Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger to drive for them in 1996 and 1997, but the team would never again reach championship heights, with the team achieving just one final Grand Prix victory at the hands of Gerhard Berger in 1997. Even podiums became hard to come by for the team, and the struggling Enstone outfit would eventually be purchased by Renault for complete transformation in 2002. After Benetton's success in 1995, Williams would retake championship glory in 1996 and 1997, whilst using Renault power. This arrangement could have kept on going, but Renault had other ideas. At the end of 1997, Renault would withdraw from Formula 1, and the only engines that remained in the sport with Renault ancestry would be the Playlife, Supertech and Mechachrome engines that were essentially the 1997 Renault RS9, just slightly retuned. These engines did not maintain the level of success as the proper Renault-badged variants, and the teams that ran them, Williams and Benetton, had limited success whilst using them. Renault, however, would eventually make a full return to the sport, first with a 2001 return supplying engines to Benetton, and then completely taking the team over in 2002 when they would go on to use the engines entirely by themselves. Renault finally tasted championship champagne not just as an engine supplier but as a constructor in 2005 with the Renault R25, and Fernando Alonso leading home the championship charge. Alonso would again challenge for the championship in 2006, driving the R26 and the new 2.4-litre V8 engines. This Renault V8 would later power Red Bull to championships in later years, though we won't be focusing on that in this video. The R26 was designed around the revolutionary mass damper, a device typically used to prevent buildings from collapsing during earthquakes. The mass damper kept the R26 stable even under the most violent of manoeuvres. Even if the car went off track, it would remain very stable, something that its closest competitors, Ferrari, were simply unable to do. This gave Renault a crucial edge over their competitors, allowing them to win 7 of the first 9 rounds of the championship, with 6 of those at the hands of Alonso and 1 at the hand of his teammate Giancarlo Fisichella. For the 2 rounds that Alonso didn't win, he was always just behind, in second place. This all changed, however, when the mass damper was banned halfway through the season, and the R26, having been designed around it, suffered immensely. With Renault's pace now lacking and clearly second best, Schumacher and Ferrari were able to win 5 of the remaining 7 rounds of the season after the mass damper was banned at the German Grand Prix. It was looking certain that Schumacher would take his 8th Drivers' Championship that year, and Ferrari would take another Constructors' title as well, after having an off year in 2005. But an exceptionally rare engine failure for Schumacher at the Japanese Grand Prix all but ended his title hopes and practically gifted the championship to Alonso and Renault on a silver plate. With Renault taking their 2nd consecutive Constructors and Drivers titles, things were looking up for them. But this would ultimately prove to be the high point of Renault's time in Formula 1 as a constructor, as after this point the team began a bit of a downward slope. Alonso would jump ship from McLaren in 2007, though he would return in 2008 after the relationship in that team broke down. He would score 2 more wins for Renault in 2008, one of which was the controversial Singapore Grand Prix that was marred by the Crashgate scandal. This would ultimately see Renault begin the process to withdraw from the sport yet again, though they would remain supplying engines for the foreseeable future. For the 2010 season, Fernando Alonso would leave the team for the final time for Ferrari. He would be replaced by Robert Kubica, and Vitaly Petrov would partner him to drive the R30 for the 2010 championship. The R30 immediately proved to be far more competitive than its predecessor, the R29, when it scored a podium in just its 2nd race, something that the R29 had only managed to do after 14 races. The car would go on to achieve a further 2 podiums that season, both at the hands of Kubica, which included a 3rd place finish at Monaco. Renault would prove to be a strong contender for 4th place in the 2010 championship, but they were held back by the inconsistent performances of Petrov, who would score only 5 times across the season. By comparison, Kubica would score in all but 1 of the races that he finished. This meant that Renault would finish the 2010 season with 163 points, enough for just 5th in the Constructors' Championship. It was still a promising result for the team, however, who were under new management from Genei Capital. This would be the last season that Renault would compete entirely under the Renault name until 2016. As for 2011, they would take on a new identity, Lotus Renault. On paper, things appear to have started well for Renault's 2011 season, with 2 podiums in the first 2 races. However, behind the scenes, things were far more grim. Their leading driver, Robert Kubica, suffered a near-fatal rallying accident in the winter off-season, and he would be replaced by his former Sauber teammate, Nick Heidfeld. He himself would be replaced mid-season by Bruno Senna, with the team citing a lack of performance, which is rather odd because he was performing much better than his teammate Vitaly Petrov. Renault's car that season, the R31, would use a distinctive forward-facing exhaust that gave it a unique machine gun-esque rattle as it went through corners. It may have sounded good, but it hurt the car's performance more than it helped. Race pace performance of the car degraded as the season went on, and with the replacement of Heidfeld for Senna, who was clearly not his legendary Uncle Ayrton, the team would finish a disappointing 5th in the Constructors with only 73 points. At the end of the season, the Renault name would leave the team, leaving just Lotus in its stead. For the 2012 Formula 1 season, the newly rebranded Lotus Formula 1 team would field the E20, driven by the legendary Kimi Raikkonen and his new teammate Romain Grosjean. The car would also be driven by Jerome D'Ambrosio after Grosjean received a race ban for causing the Turn 1 pile-up at the Belgian Grand Prix. The E20 was much more competitive than its immediate predecessor, the R31, as it would score at every single round of the championship. Of those points finishes, 10 of them would be podiums, the majority of which would come before the summer break. But the highlight of the car's season would come at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Raikkonen would start that race in 4th, but he would snatch up 2 positions on the opening lap and would later inherit the lead after the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton suffered a terminal fault. From that point on, Raikkonen never relinquished the lead, and he took the checkered flag in first place, giving the Lotus team its first win, the E20 its only win, and the first win for a car under the Lotus name since 1987. The team just had to leave Kimi alone, he knew what to do. The Lotus team would take 303 points away from that season, enough to finish 4th in the Constructors' standings, well ahead of 5th placed Mercedes, but some distance behind 3rd placed McLaren. It should be noted that Lotus did not believe that their car was going to be this good. In fact, they had so little faith in it that when they signed Kimi Raikkonen to the team, his contract had a clause that gave him a €50,000 bonus for every point that he scored. Raikkonen scored 207 points in 2012, and he would continue to score in the following season. Lotus would field the E21 for the 2013 season, a season they would begin in sensational style, with Kimi Raikkonen taking the opening victory of the season in Australia. The E21 was a very competitive car, as it would continue to pick up regular podiums across the season, 14 in total, with the majority of them being scored by Raikkonen. Grosjean would stand on the podium himself, with a best result of second at the United States Grand Prix. The E21 was a somewhat distant shout for second place in the Constructors' Championship, a position they held until the Bahrain Grand Prix. Ferrari would overtake them at the Spanish Grand Prix, and Lotus could never re-overtake them, and then Mercedes would catch up and overtake them shortly afterwards. It did look like for a time that Lotus might be able to take third from Ferrari, but things came to a head in the Raikkonen situation. By the time that Kimi DNF'd from the third to last round in Abu Dhabi, he had scored a total of 390 points for Lotus, which meant a hefty bonus of 19.5 million euros, a sum that Lotus simply couldn't afford to pay. He single-handedly bankrupted the team. The ensuing salary dispute cast his future with the team into doubt, and ultimately he would sign a contract with Ferrari for 2014, and it even looked like he would miss the remaining rounds of the season. Whilst a provisional agreement was reached, Kimi would miss the last 2 rounds of the season regardless, as he opted to have back surgery for issues he had suffered earlier in the year. The whole Raikkonen situation was one of just a multitude of issues that were facing Lotus, and would ultimately lead to the team's decline. Whilst the Lotus were claiming 4th in the Constructors' Championship in 2013, Renault would also power Red Bull to championship glory for what would turn out to be Renault's last ever World Championship. Red Bull would score an astonishing number of victories that season, including 9 in a row from the summer break right to the end of the season, all at the hands of champion Sebastian Vettel. Renault would never again reach these heights. In stark contrast to the start of the 2013 season, Lotus's 2014 season would start very poorly, with the team failing to score for the first 4 rounds of the championship. Renault's new 1.6-litre turbo hybrid power unit was unreliable and underpowered compared to the leading Mercedes power units, and the twin-tusked Lotus E22 was a fundamentally flawed car. Despite the number of upgrades that Lotus would apply to the car over the season, it just never seemed to be able to improve beyond the lower midfield. The driver pairing of Romain Grosjean and the crash-happy Pastor Maldonado could only drag the car into the points only 3 times over the 19-race season. Compare this to 2013, where the Lotus teams failed to score in just 1 round. With the performance of the E22 being so poor, Lotus would opt to end development of the car early on in the season to focus on 2015, and not only that, they would choose to end their partnership with Renault and choose Mercedes power units for 2015 instead, much to the fury of then Renault head Cyril Abiteboul. After finishing 4th with 315 points in the 2013 championship, Lotus ultimately slumped to 8th in 2014, scoring just 10 points, with a best finish of 2 8th places at the hands of Romain Grosjean. This meant a massive reduction in prize money, and would ultimately worsen the already dire financial straits that the team was in. Taking part in the 2015 Formula 1 season, the Lotus E23 was the first Team Enstone Formula 1 car in 30 years to use a power unit that wasn't Renault, or Renault-based. The E23 would instead use the Mercedes power unit, which was top of the class at the time, and arguably still is. It was hoped that the Mercedes power unit would help the team score better results across the season, and it certainly did appear to help, as the team would ultimately finish 6th in the Constructors' Championship that season with 78 points to their name, including a podium, something they hadn't had since 2013, though arguably this podium was more out of luck than actual merit, as it would be scored after the Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel retired in the penultimate lap of the Belgian Grand Prix. The E23 would be a much more consistent point scorer than its predecessor, the E22, but ultimately this wouldn't help the team's position, and the move to Mercedes power had angered Renault so much that they decided to buy back the team from GenAI Capital. Or maybe the Lotus team had so many debts, GenAI Capital sold the team back. It's one or the other. Either way, by the end of 2015, the Lotus name was out of Formula 1 for the second time, and perhaps this time, the final time. And for 2016, Team Enstone would again be labelled as Renault, and would use Renault power units again. What could possibly go wrong? It wasn't just the relationship with Lotus that had gone awry, however. Renault's relationship with Red Bull had also collapsed, and Red Bull wanted out. However, with Ferrari and Mercedes unwilling to power them, and Honda looking absolutely crap, Red Bull had no real option but to stay with Renault, but not as a works team anymore, instead simply as a customer team. And with Renault buying back Team Enstone, this was their way to stay in the sport with a works team. The first Renault-badged Formula 1 car for a number of years, the Renault RS16 would be driven by Kevin Magnussen and Jolyon Palmer for the 2016 Formula 1 season. The RS16 was essentially just a rebadged, evolved version of the previous year's Lotus E23, modified to use a Renault power unit instead of the Mercedes. These modifications were significant, as the car had, of course, originally been designed to use the Mercedes power unit. That was about as much development work as the RS16 ever received. Whilst it did receive a handful of upgrades across the season, Renault decided to use 2016 as a test and development year instead, since this was the final year of the 2009 aero regulations. As such, the RS16 was little more than a backmarker, only scoring 3 times across the 21 race season for a minuscule 8 points, enough for only 9th in the Constructors' Championship. But this result mattered not, because this was the beginning of Renault's 5-year 100 race plan to become champions of the world once again. What could possibly go wrong? The first all-Renault Formula 1 car since Team Enstone was reacquired by the French marque, the Renault RS17 showed significant developmental progress over its predecessor. The car would be driven the entirety of the season by Nico Hülkenberg and initially by Jolyon Palmer, before he would be replaced in the second half of the year by Carlos Sainz. Hülkenberg would go on to score the majority of the team's points that season, with a best finish of 6th place on 4 separate occasions. Meanwhile, Jolyon Palmer could only finish 6th once at the Singapore Grand Prix before his replacement, and Carlos Sainz, although initially impressing with a P7 on his debut in the United States, didn't score again afterwards. Together, the three drivers would go on to score 57 points for Renault across the season, enough for 6th place in the Constructors' Championship, a respectable improvement and a clear statement of intent from Renault. They were climbing up the ranks. They were coming. What could possibly go wrong? Driven by Nico Hülkenberg and Carlos Sainz, the Renault RS18 was another vast improvement over its direct predecessor. Whilst the RS17 had been an infrequent point scorer, and only with one car, the RS18 would be a much more frequent point scorer with both cars, with Hülkenberg and Sainz scoring 122 points between them, which would be enough for 4th in the Constructors' Championship, Renault's best result since their full return. More often than not, the RS18 was scoring double point finishes, even as its pace dropped off towards the end of the season. This helped the team greatly in their battle with Haas for 4th in the Constructors' Championship, with Haas proving to be much more inconsistent and even earning 2 race disqualifications, something that Renault didn't get. As such, Renault would safely secure 4th, and it looked like their 5-year plan was coming on nicely. There were, however, some flies in the ointment. Carlos Sainz, after spending just 1.5 years with the team, would be booted out in favour of Daniel Ricciardo, who made his very high-profile departure from Red Bull at the end of the season. Red Bull themselves would also make their final divorce with Renault, with sister team Toro Rosso dropping Renault power units at the end of 2017 in favour of running Honda units for 2018, in preparation for Red Bull themselves to take them on for 2019. Red Bull would drop Renault power units, with the team taking its final victory under Renault power with Max Verstappen at the Mexican Grand Prix, albeit this was under the Tag Heuer moniker instead of proper Renault badged engines. This would leave Renault with just one customer engine supply, McLaren, who had abandoned Honda engines at the end of 2017 in favour of the French marque. The last time McLaren had run French engines was back in 1994, something that went rather disastrously when they ran Peugeot engines, but the Renaults at least powered McLaren to 6th in the Constructors' Championship that season, a marked improvement over the 9th they had with Honda engines in 2017. As for Renault themselves, now with a proven race winner in Daniel Ricciardo driving one of their cars, well, what could possibly go wrong? Things had been looking up for Renault at the end of 2018. It was looking like they were well on their way to joining the top 3 teams and becoming a top 4 team instead. But for 2019, instead of continuing their upward trajectory, the Renault RS19 proved to be a stagnation of Renault's progress, and in fact, they actually fell a bit further behind. It had been a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The RS19 would struggle with its pace for the entire first half of the season, even suffering 2 double retirements at the second round in Bahrain and the 11th round in Germany, including Nico Hülkenberg crashing out from what could have potentially been his first ever podium drive. The RS19 struggled at circuits that required high downforce, but at power circuits, low downforce tracks such as Monza, the car thrived, scoring 4th and 5th in Italy, its best results of the season. That result propelled them from a lowly 6th in the Constructors' Championship to 5th, where they would finish the season, behind their customer team, the McLaren, who were proving to be somewhat resurgent. Even though Renault's second half of the season was better than its first, it would still have its downsides, such as an embarrassing double disqualification at the Japanese Grand Prix owing to an innovative braking system. Thus, Renault would only score 91 points, which would be enough for a very close 5th place in the championship, with the Honda-powered Toro Rossos close behind with 85 points. McLaren, who had taken on Renault power just a year prior, were now proving to be far better than the Works team, with 145 points and a podium finish, something that Renault had yet to achieve. It was clear that things had to change, and Renault decided that they would drop Nico Hülkenberg and replace him with Esteban Ocon for 2020. The 5-year plan wasn't looking quite so solid anymore, but hopefully this was just a blip. What could possibly go wrong? "2020 was the second year of Daniel Ricciardo's initial 2-year contract with Renault Formula 1 team, and it was already set to be his last before the season even got going. He had already lost all confidence in the team, as he felt that this outfit would not be able to win championships, and he would instead sign for McLaren for 2021 onwards. But for 2020 he still had to compete in the yellow and black B machine, and he had to give Cyril Abiteboul a tattoo on his butt, or something, if he managed to get a podium, which he did ultimately achieve. Twice, in fact, at the Eiffel and Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. His teammate Esteban Ocon would also go on to score a podium at the Sakir Grand Prix, although I'm not sure Cyril had to get a tattoo for that one though. Renault's 2020 challenger, the RS20, was a stark improvement over the RS19, as it would score on almost every single occasion across the COVID-shortened 17-race calendar of the 2020 season. Just like its predecessor, it appeared to perform better on low downforce circuits, achieving 4th and 5th at the Belgian Grand Prix, and then of course the 2nd place at the Sakir Grand Prix on the Bahrain outer circuit. Altogether, Ricciardo and Ocon would go on to score 181 points for Renault across 2020, which would have been more than enough for a comfortable 4th place finish in both 2018 and 2019. But in 2020, this was only enough for 5th. It was a very close battle for 3rd in the Constructors between Renault, its customer team McLaren, and the Racing Point team, as one of the top 3 teams, Ferrari, had fallen down the order owing to sanctions from the previous season. Even though Racing Point was carrying a 15-point penalty from illegally copying elements of the previous year's Mercedes W10, the pink Racing Point machine would ultimately finish in 4th place in the Constructors' Championship, ahead of Renault, largely owing to the fact that they had a race victory at the Sakir Grand Prix, the same race that Renault and Ocon scored second in. And once again, Renault would be humiliated by their customer team McLaren, who would finish in third. But they wouldn't have to be humiliated for much longer, as McLaren would dump Renault power units for 2021 in favour of Mercedes, meaning that only Renault, now Alpine, would be running their own engines. A few things would change at Team Enstone for 2021. First off, the team would rename itself to Alpine after Renault's sports car brand, and the outgoing Daniel Ricciardo would be replaced by the returning Fernando Alonso, the driver who had, of course, given them championship victories 2 years in a row in the mid-2000s, when the team was in its first iteration as Renault. Alonso would partner Esteban Ocon to drive what was essentially a rebranded Renault RS20, now called the Alpine A521. Another change at the team would be that longtime team principal Cyril Abiteboul would also be replaced by someone else whose name I cannot remember. This would also be the last year that Renault engines would use the old combined turbo concept, before switching to the split turbo concept that the other engine manufacturers were using in 2022. The A521 looked fantastic in its striking blue and red livery, but this did not help it secure particularly good results. Once again, Team Enstone had produced another midfield car, one that would be fighting for 5th in the Constructors' Championship with AlphaTauri. Alpine did eventually succeed in securing 5th place in the Constructors, managing to score 2 podiums along the way. Alonso would score a 3rd place at the Qatar Grand Prix. But most importantly would be Esteban Ocon taking an unprecedented race victory at the Hungarian Grand Prix, a race beset by chaos. Ocon would keep his cool and withstand the pressure of the many assaults from the Aston Martin of Sebastian Vettel, taking his first and so far only race victory in the sport, but also, rather somberly, taking what would turn out to be the last ever victory by a Renault-powered car. Whilst the Enstone team may one day gain another victory to its name, it won't be with Renault power. But we're not done with the Alpine story just yet. It's only just begun. Sort of. Because by this point the 100 race 5-year plan that Renault had put into place back in 2016 was in shambles. So now it was time for another 100 race 5-year plan thing. They would be on top of the world in 100 races. Mark their words. What could possibly go wrong? For 2022, Alpine would retain Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon to drive the A522 in the new ground effect era. Other new things included the aforementioned split turbo engine, which changed the sound profile of the engine quite a bit, and another new team principal, former Aston Martin team principal Otmar Safnauer. Although the season would begin well for Alpine, outscoring previous customer team McLaren, there would be some early signs of friction between the team's 2 drivers. They would battle for much of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, something that gave them a lot of screen time, which made the bosses happy, but at the same time was not something they actually really wanted to see. They wanted their cars to be fighting other teams, not each other. The relationship between Alonso and Ocon would only continue to break down as the season went on. The relationship completely broke down by the Hungarian Grand Prix, when Ocon almost caused Alonso to crash. This incident would prompt Alonso to announce his departure from the team and that he would be joining Aston Martin for 2023. What followed would be one of the most infamous driver sagas that the sport would ever see, with Alpine announcing that their junior driver Oscar Piastri would be driving for them in 2023, only for him to then publicly refute their claims and that he would not be driving for them after all. That's a story for another day, however. The A522 was an acceptable car. Although it wasn't capable of picking up a podium finish like its two predecessors, the RS20 and the A521, the A522 would still at least score enough points to finally be able to finish ahead of McLaren in the Constructors' Championship for the first time since 2018. Alpine would take the lead in their season-long battle for fourth in the Constructors' Championship at the Japanese Grand Prix, and they wouldn't relinquish it again to the Papaya squad. They would finish the 2022 season with 173 points to their name, enough to finish fourth in the Constructors' Championship, albeit a very distant fourth, being almost 350 points behind third-placed Mercedes. It certainly wasn't a great start to the ground effect era for Alpine, but it was clearly something to build upon. It looked good for once.
Okay, that last lap was a 1 minute 31.7.
Following the Oscar Piastri saga, Alpine was left scrambling for a driver to partner Esteban Ocon for the 2023 season, and they settled on Red Bull reject Pierre Gasly. So they partnered Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, a team-up that could not possibly go wrong, would drive the A523 in the 2023 Formula 1 season. This partnership proved its worth in only the third round of the season, when the two would collide on a red flag restart at the Australian Grand Prix, wiping them both out of the points-paying positions. Very embarrassing. And what was proving to be a trend with Team Enstone cars at this point, the A523 was yet another case of one step forward, two steps back. Quite literally this time, as the A523 was be outclassed not just by the McLaren as before, but by the Aston Martins too now. Despite the fact that McLaren had had a very poor start to their season, and that Aston Martin would have a very poor end to their season, Alpine would just be in no man's land in 6th, too distant to challenge for 5th, but too far ahead of 7th to be under any realistic threat from behind. No amount of 100 race, 5-year plans could help the performance of the Alpine cars at this point. Sure, it was good enough to finish in 6th, but that was quite the downgrade from 4th the previous season, and 5th in the 3 seasons before that. The Renault engine simply wasn't up to par. It was down on power, though it wasn't entirely Renault's fault. An engine freeze had been instituted for 2022 onwards, and the initial variant of this Renault power plant was down on power. Renault requested special permission to bring upgrades to their power unit to bring it on par with the other engine manufacturers, but Mercedes, Ferrari and Honda all vetoed it, meaning that Renault would be down on power for the rest of the ground effect era. This power deficit would leave Alpine struggling at power-sensitive tracks, but it would perform reasonably well at tracks where power wasn't so much of an issue. managing to score a third-place podium at the Monaco Grand Prix and another third-place podium at the Dutch Grand Prix. It was a thoroughly unremarkable season for the Enstone outfit. They were outdeveloped by McLaren, and the car was clearly no longer moving forward. There was, however, one direction it could continue to move in: backwards. For the 2024 season, Alpine would field the A524, a car that was flawed before it even hit the track. Alpine had attempted to bring innovative new wing structures to their car, but when these parts failed crash testing, Alpine was forced to strengthen them, which made them much heavier than anticipated. As such, Alpine ran into panic mode and stripped the car of almost all of its paint in a desperate attempt to save on weight and get the car to the minimum weight limit. These desperate measures did not help the performance of the car, as it was way off the pace compared to every other car on the grid, initially starting the season as the slowest car on the entire grid, qualifying 19th and 20th at the very first race of the season. That's what happens when you combine the worst engine with the heaviest chassis. To their credit, however, Alpine would make strides in bringing upgrades to the car, and it would gradually start to finish in the points, something that you couldn't say about the Saubers. Ocon and Gasly would pick up a fair amount of 9th and 10th places, enough to bring the team off the bottom of the championship table, and by the time the Sao Paulo Grand Prix rolled around, they were sitting 9th in the Constructors' Championship, just 4 points behind Williams. It looked like a mountain that they wouldn't be able to climb. It was at that race that Alpine bought its best upgrade of the season, with Gasly managing to finish the sprint race in 7th, the best finishing position for an Alpine car in either the Grand Prix or the sprint all season long. But it was at the Grand Prix itself that fortunes for the team would change entirely. The team was able to take advantage of a red flag period to change their tyres without actually having to go through a pit stop, a rule that remains controversial to this day. This meant that Alpine would hold on to what would be an astonishing 2nd and 3rd positions to the end of the race, a result that the A524 frankly did not deserve. I stand by that. This shocking double podium catapulted Alpine from 9th to 6th in the Constructors' Championship, a result that made it look like the team didn't have such a bad season after all. But it was really just flattering the car's poor performance and masked the declining performance of the team itself. And so, 2025, the most recent season to have occurred at the time of recording. Esteban Ocon would be booted from the team in favour of Jack Doohan, though he would not last very long before he too would be booted in favour of Franco Colapinto. Not that it mattered, both drivers didn't score a single point. All 22 points that the Alpine A525 would score would be at the hands of Pierre Gasly. Whilst the car had looked fairly decent in pre-season testing, that form quickly came undone in the season itself, as the car would prove to be, without a doubt, the worst of the season. Whilst 22 points would have been enough for 8th in 2024, the 2025 field was so competitive that Alpine ended up setting a record for the most points scored by the last placed constructor. Alpine finished dead last out of 10 teams, and the writing was finally on the wall for Renault. With the controversial figure of Flavio Briatore back in control of the team, he made the decision that Alpine would be powered by Mercedes from 2026 onwards, bringing an end to the Renault engine dynasty in Formula 1, at least for the foreseeable future. But with the very plant basically packing it up all engine operations, it looks like that this time Renault might be out of the sport for good. As you could probably have guessed from the amount of points that this car scored, the A525 performed very poorly across the season. Its best result was 6th place at the British Grand Prix, but after that it could only manage a best of 8th in the Sao Paulo sprint. In fact, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix would be the last time that a Renault-powered car would ever score points in Formula 1, 1 year on from the shock double podium finish in 2024. And only a few races later, Renault engines would turn their final laps at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and an embarrassing performance it was. For a manufacturer that has won multiple races and multiple world titles powering many different teams, Renault engines went out not with a bang, but a whimper, qualifying and finishing P19 and P20 in Abu Dhabi. A pathetic and ignominious end to one of Formula 1's greatest engine manufacturers. Team Enstone and Alpine live on, but with Mercedes engines under their hood. Let's see how things go in 2026. It wasn't all doom and gloom for the Alpine name in 2025, however. Although it isn't the most competitive machine, the Alpine A424 is an LMDH spec Le Mans hypercar competing in the FIA World Endurance Championship. Powered by a heavily modified Mechachrome V64 engine commonly found in the Formula 2 cars, the Alpine A424 has performed fairly decently over its 2 years of competition in the WEC, picking up a 3rd place at the 6 Hours of Fuji in 2024, and then going on to one-up that 1 year later with a 1st place finish at the same event in 2025. This would only be enough for the team to finish 6th in the WEC Manufacturers' Championship with 86 points. But with any luck, the team will be able to score more frequently in 2026 as they bring an Evo upgrade to the A424. Of course, they have stiff competition from manufacturers like Ferrari, Toyota, Cadillac, BMW and even Aston Martin, so Alpine has a lot of work to do for 2026.